Look at Japan from the outside, and you'll see an impressive facade. Cutting-edge robotics, technological innovation that leads the world, virtually zero crime rates, a rich cultural heritage that captivates millions, the world's third-largest economy, and globally recognized brands that define quality and precision. By almost every measure, Japan appears to be a model society, efficient, safe, and prosperous. But beneath this polished surface lies a far more troubling reality. Hidden in plain sight are millions of Japanese citizens who have been systematically excluded from the very system that made their country great. They're known as the Lost Generation, a cohort representing nearly 15% of Japan's population who missed their single opportunity to enter stable employment and have been locked out ever since. Their story isn't just about economic hardship. It's a warning about what happens when rigid systems collide with economic disaster, and why Japan's brightest decades may be permanently behind it. This is the untold story of Japan's lost generation, and why it matters far beyond Japan's borders. To understand how millions fell through the cracks, we first need to understand how high Japan climbed. It's hard to imagine now, but in the 1980s, Japan wasn't just successful, it was terrifying to the West. American magazines ran covers asking if we were witnessing an economic Pearl Harbor. Hollywood films like Die Hard, Rising Sun, and Blade Runner all featured the same trope: Japanese corporations as the new global overlords, buying up American landmarks and taking over the world economy. This wasn't paranoid fiction, it felt inevitable. The numbers backed up the anxiety. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Japan experienced what economists called the Japanese miracle, 3 consecutive decades of extraordinary economic growth that transformed a war-devastated nation into an economic superpower. By 1991, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy, trailing only the United States. This miracle was built on a unique economic model that, at the time, seemed superior to Western capitalism. At its core were the keiretsu, massive corporate alliances where Japan's biggest companies owned shares in each other and coordinated strategies. Think Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, industrial giants that weren't technically monopolies, but functioned like coordinated empires. These alliances received virtually unlimited cheap loans from the state-controlled Bank of Japan, giving them an endless stream of capital to fund aggressive global expansion. Meanwhile, the Japanese government erected walls to keep foreign competition out of domestic markets. It was economic nationalism on a grand scale, and for decades, it worked spectacularly. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the system offered something even more valuable than wealth: certainty. Work hard, get a university degree, and you were virtually guaranteed a job at a major corporation with lifetime employment. The Japanese called it shushinkoyo, a social contract that promised stability, predictable career progression, and dignity in return for loyalty and hard work. Japan was unstoppable. The Nikkei stock index soared. Japanese products conquered market after market. Real estate values climbed to absurd heights. At one point, the land beneath Tokyo's Imperial Palace was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California combined. Everything was going up, 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 until it wasn't. By the late 1980s, warning signs were everywhere, but speculation had replaced rationality. Everyone believed the boom would continue forever. The Bank of Japan kept printing money and handing out loans to anyone who asked, regardless of creditworthiness or what the money was for. Asset prices detached completely from reality. Then, in 1990, the bubble burst. Throughout that year, the stock market crashed by 43%. The Nikkei 225, which had peaked at nearly 39,000 points on December 29, 1989, plummeted to below 15,000 by August 1992. Real estate prices followed in a downward spiral that would last for decades. By 2004, prime commercial properties in Tokyo had fallen to less than 1% of their peak values. But the crash itself wasn't the real catastrophe. Economic bubbles burst. It happens. What made Japan's collapse uniquely devastating was what came next. The revelation that the entire system was rotten. Corruption was everywhere. Insider trading, stock manipulation, bribery, fraud. It permeated every level of Japanese business and government. The supposedly efficient keiretsu system had created hundreds of zombie companies, businesses that should have failed years ago but kept surviving on an endless supply of cheap government loans. Banks, terrified of recognizing their bad debts, kept these corpses alive with evergreen loans, creating a stagnant corporate sector unable to hire new workers or innovate. Within a decade, Japan went from being called an economic tiger, riding the Japanese miracle, to being labeled the sick man of Asia. Economic downturns happened to every country, but what made Japan's crisis unique and what created the lost generation was the catastrophic collision between economic disaster and Japan's uniquely rigid employment system. To understand why Japan's recession destroyed an entire generation's future, you need to understand how different Japanese hiring practices are from anywhere else in the world. In Japan, your career begins with shushoku katsuro, the job hunting ritual. It's a synchronized, nationwide process that happens once a year, and it looks like something out of a dystopian film. Thousands of university students, all dressed in identical black and white suits, attending mass group interviews and seminars held by major corporations. Here's the critical part. Many Japanese companies, especially the prestigious keiretsu giants, hire only fresh university graduates. Not people with experience, not career changers, only new graduates once a year in mass cohorts. If you get hired, the company expects you to stay for life under the Shushinkoyo system. They'll train you, promote you from within, a policy called Shanai Shoshin, grooming you over decades to eventually become an executive. This system provided incredible stability when times were good, but it had a fatal flaw. It left zero room for second chances. If you graduated during a recession and couldn't find a job in that annual hiring window, you were finished. Once you were no longer a fresh graduate, companies wouldn't hire you. They were only interested in the new crop of graduates they could mold from scratch. Miss your one shot, and the doors of corporate Japan slammed shut forever. And that's exactly what happened to the lost generation. When the bubble burst in 1990, companies immediately froze hiring, not just reduced it, but froze it almost entirely. They did this to protect their existing lifetime employees during the crisis. For nearly the entire decade of the 1990s, the annual hiring ritual that millions of young Japanese had prepared for their entire lives simply stopped. This period became known as the Employment Ice Age, lasting roughly from 1993 to 2004. The unemployment rate, which had been just 2.2% in 1992, soared to 5.4% by 2002, the worst level since the 1950s. But that national figure obscures the real catastrophe. Youth unemployment was far worse. Academic research by economist Ayako Kondo, published in 2024 in the Social Science Japan Journal, documents the mechanism of exclusion with brutal clarity. The cohorts who graduated between 1993 and 2004, the Ice Age cohorts, faced labor market conditions at entry that were utterly catastrophic. The ratio of job openings to applicants, which had been 1.43 in 1991, collapsed to just 0.45 by 2009. By the time companies resumed hiring in the early 2000s, the lost generation had missed their window. They were no longer fresh graduates, so they were invisible to the corporate hiring system. An entire generation, millions of people whose only fault was being born at the wrong time, fell through the cracks. According to government data, approximately 17 million people, nearly 15% of Japan's population, are considered part of this lost generation. They were forced into irregular employment, temporary contracts, part-time work, or what the Japanese call furita, freeders, perpetual low-wage, insecure jobs with no benefits, no path to promotion, and no retirement security. The OECD reports that by 2020, irregular workers constituted 37.9% of Japan's workforce, 21.2 million people trapped in precarious employment. And because the Japanese economy never fully recovered, younger cohorts graduating in the 2000s and 2010s joined their ranks. What was supposed to be a temporary crisis became a permanent feature of Japanese society. The economic exclusion of the lost generation triggered something unprecedented in Japanese society: mass social withdrawal. Unable to fulfill the expectations Japanese society placed on men, get a stable job, climb the career ladder, marry, support a family. Many simply gave up entirely. They became hikikomori, individuals who voluntarily withdraw from society, spending 6 months or longer in complete isolation, rarely or never leaving their homes, severing virtually all social contact. The numbers are staggering. According to Japan's Cabinet Office, approximately 1.5 million people across all age groups were hikikomori. As of 2023, about 2% of Japanese people aged 15 to 39 were hikikomori in 2016. But the phenomenon has expanded dramatically to include older individuals. A 2019 government survey found an estimated 613,000 hikikomori in their 40s and 50s, members of the original lost generation now entering middle age. Men make up about 60% of the hikikomori population. These aren't lazy or antisocial people. They're often individuals who internalize Japan's cultural values so deeply that when they couldn't meet those expectations, they experienced profound shame and simply retreated from the world entirely. The OECD notes that seeking help takes an average of more than 4 years for hikikomori, and many never seek assistance at all. This withdrawal has created what Japanese society calls the 8,500 problem, a grim phenomenon where elderly parents in their 80s are forced to financially support their reclusive, unemployed children in their 50s on meager pensions. When these parents die, many hikikomori face complete destitution, having never built careers, savings, or social safety nets. The social costs extend beyond isolation. Research links the lost generation's economic desperation to rising violence. Several of Japan's most notorious recent crimes were committed by middle-aged men from this cohort. The 2019 knife attack that killed 2 and injured 19, carried out by a 45-year-old who had never left his parents' home. The 2021 Joker attack by an unemployed man discontented with society. Even the 2022 assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe by Tetsuya Yamagami, a former Self-Defense Forces member who struggled to find stable employment. But perhaps the most profound impact is what never happened. The families that were never formed, the children who were never born. Financial insecurity prevented millions in the lost generation from marrying or having children during their prime reproductive years. Japanese women traditionally expect men to be financial providers, so men without stable income either cannot find partners or feel too ashamed to try. This created the phenomenon of soshokukei danshi, herbivore men or grass eaters, referring to an estimated 75% of Japanese men in their 20s through 40s who do not date or marry. The result? Japan now has one of the world's lowest birth rates. In 2020, the fertility rate fell to just 1.34 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to maintain population levels. The number of marriages registered in 2020 fell 12.3% to just 525,490. The lost generation's missing children have become a demographic black hole, accelerating Japan's population crisis. The lost generation isn't just a social tragedy, it's an existential economic threat. Japan currently has the world's highest percentage of elderly people. Nearly 30% of the population is over 65. It's aging more rapidly than any other country in human history. And the lost generation has made this crisis immeasurably worse. Think about the role this generation should be playing right now. People in their 30s, 40s, and early 50s, the lost generation cohorts, should be the engine of the Japanese economy. This is the age when people spend the most on houses, mortgages, cars, raising families, consuming goods and services. They should be at peak earning power, paying the taxes that support social systems. They should be the dynamic middle of the workforce, leading companies, starting businesses, driving innovation. Instead, approximately 17 million people in this age bracket are stuck in irregular employment or have withdrawn from society entirely. They have minimal purchasing power, pay minimal taxes, and haven't had the children who would become the next generation of workers and consumers. By 2050, Japan's demographic structure will be catastrophic. The ratio of elderly to working-age people will reach 1 to 1.3, meaning there will be almost as many people over 65 as there are people between 15 and 64. Projections show the elderly population will reach 38% by 2070. In every society, the elderly depend on taxes paid by working-age people. But in Japan, this will soon become mathematically unsustainable. The lost generation never earned enough to build retirement savings. When they reach old age in the 2030s and 2040s, they'll need government support, but there won't be enough younger workers to fund it. Economists warn of a secondary crisis: mass elderly poverty among the lost generation, who will retire with neither pensions nor savings. And here's the truly tragic part. The children the lost generation never had would be entering the workforce right now, in their teens and 20s, exactly when Japan desperately needs them. After every recession, economies typically recover, and new graduates entering the job market during the recovery enjoy better opportunities. But groundbreaking research published in 2024 reveals something deeply disturbing about Japan. The recovery never came for younger cohorts. Economist Ayako Kondo's research, analyzing data from 1984 to 2013, found what she calls the disappearance of scarring effects. Here's what that means. For older cohorts who graduated before the Ice Age, entering the labor market during a recession had predictable negative effects on employment and earnings that persisted for years. Classic economic scarring. But for cohorts who graduated during or after the employment Ice Age, something strange happened. Even those who entered the labor market during the supposed recovery in the mid-2000s had employment rates and earnings almost as low as those who graduated at the absolute worst point of the crisis. In other words, graduating when unemployment was low no longer provided any advantage. The system itself had permanently broken. Why? Several factors explain this structural break. First, zombie companies. Banks kept insolvent corporations alive with continuous loans rather than letting them fail. By 2000, these zombie firms comprised a significant portion of the Japanese economy. They couldn't hire, couldn't grow, couldn't innovate. They just existed, blocking more efficient firms from taking their place and depressing wages and job creation across the entire economy. Second, the erosion of lifetime employment. The recession destroyed the old social contract. Companies could no longer afford to promise jobs for life, so they shifted to flexible, disposable workers. But they didn't replace lifetime employment with a functional mid-career hiring system. They just stopped hiring. The ratio of workers with lifetime employment fell from 39% to much lower levels. But this didn't create opportunity. It created permanent precarity. Third, increased job instability became normalized. Data shows that the one-year job quitting rate for Ice Age cohorts was 1 to 2 percentage points higher than for bubble economy cohorts. Job mobility increased, but not in a healthy way. It was churn among insecure, low-wage positions, not movement up career ladders. Fourth, the loss of company investment in human capital. When companies stopped hiring permanent workers, they could train and develop. They stopped investing in workers' skills. This created a vicious cycle. Workers couldn't develop expertise, so they remained less productive, so companies had less reason to invest in them. Kondo's research found that the statistical effects of unemployment rates at labor market entry became insignificant for cohorts entering after the Ice Age. The tight labor market of the mid-2000s recovery did nothing to help new graduates because the fundamental structure had changed. It's not about the economic cycle anymore. It's about permanent transformation of the Japanese labor market into something less functional, less equitable, and less capable of developing human potential. The Japanese government is not unaware of this crisis. They know the lost generation threatens Japan's economic future and demographic survival. Since 2020, they've pledged approximately 65 billion yen, about $962 million, over several years, to help integrate Ice Age generation workers into stable employment, with a goal of hiring 3 million people into full-time positions. They've established community hikikomori support centers, providing counseling and referrals to mental health services. They've developed intervention programs like the 5-day hikikomori intervention at Kyushu University Hospital, which trains parents to support their withdrawn children, showing some modest success in reducing stigma and encouraging help-seeking behavior. Some companies have started accepting job applications from people who graduated 1 to 3 years prior under a policy called Dai ni Shinsotsu, second new graduates, creating limited second chances. But here's the brutal reality. For most of the lost generation, now in their 40s and 50s, these interventions are too late. You can't give someone their 20s and 30s back. You can't undo decades of irregular employment, missing skill development, and broken confidence. You can't create the families and children they never had. And the Japanese labor market remains fundamentally rigid. Companies still prioritize lifetime employment for those lucky enough to have it, still hire primarily fresh graduates once a year, still promote almost exclusively from within. The system that created the crisis still largely exists. Meanwhile, newer generations continue to struggle. While the absolute worst of the employment ice age has passed, youth unemployment remains elevated, irregular employment has become normalized, and the birth rate continues to plummet. The lost decades that began in the 1990s have now stretched past 30 years. Nikkei business writers argue that policymakers remain dangerously unaware of the crisis's true gravity, focusing disproportionately on the elderly, while the lost generation, too poor to have started families and approaching old age without resources, remains invisible. The story of Japan's lost generation is more than a cautionary tale about economic policy. It's a warning about the dangers of rigid systems and the catastrophic human cost when institutions prioritize stability over adaptability. Japan's employment system worked brilliantly for decades when the economy was growing. Lifetime employment created loyalty, expertise, and social cohesion. But when that system collided with economic crisis, it failed catastrophically. And because the system was so rigid, there was no mechanism for recovery. No second chances, no safety net, no flexibility. The result? 17 million people locked out. A generation lost. A birth rate in free fall. A demographic structure that may be impossible to sustain. And all of it perfectly predictable. The warnings were there in 1990, in 1995, in 2000. But the political will to fundamentally reform the system never materialized. Japan's GDP today is barely 3% higher than it was in 1997, an average annual growth rate of just 0.13%. The lost decades have become lost generations, and the tragedy continues to unfold. The lost generation is now approaching retirement age without adequate savings or pensions. The 8,050 problem will soon become the 9,060 problem, then worse. Their missing children means fewer workers to support an exploding elderly population. The social safety net will face pressures it was never designed to handle. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is how preventable it was. Other countries faced similar economic crises and recovered. What made Japan different was the choice to protect existing insiders, older workers with lifetime employment, at the total expense of outsiders, young people trying to enter the system. It was a choice to preserve an outdated structure rather than adapt to new realities, a choice that valued institutional continuity over human potential, a choice that sacrificed the future for the illusion of stability in the present. And now, 3 decades later, Japan is living with the consequences of that choice. A choice that turned millions of capable, educated, hard-working people into a lost generation, and in doing so, may have lost Japan's future. The world is watching Japan's demographic crisis accelerate, wondering if immigration, automation, or some policy innovation will provide an answer. But for the lost generation themselves, the question has already been answered. Their chance came and went in the 1990s, and it's never coming back.